Nurgle's battle strategy is a little different to most factions. Rather than rushing to take out enemies as fast as possible, his armies are there to slowly outlast the enemy and sap away their life as the battle goes on. This leads to him having an extremely tanky roster full of crazy high HP numbers alongside some decent damage and a whole load of poison. Let's first go over the pros and cons of the Nurgle battle gameplay. As I mentioned, they are extremely tanky, with some of the highest HP pools in the game that only get higher as you move later into the game. You also have a lot of poison damage on most of your units, meaning anything that comes at you is only going to get weaker as they take some hits. And finally, you may not have a lot of options, but the two laws you can use are pretty strong and can really carry a lot of your battles. As for the cons, of course being so tanky comes at the cost of something, and in the case of Nurgle units, that cost is speed. The majority of the army is painfully slow, meaning you really have to set up early on to avoid being caught out of position. This also makes them unpleasant to play against ranged focused armies, as you can't really do much but walk up to them and hope you survive. You also have very few ranged options yourself, especially in the early game. This means you will almost always be the one closing the gap on the enemy rather than forcing them to come to you. And finally, your late game lords and powerful units are almost all large targets, so it's very easy for the enemy to snipe them without too much trouble, so enemy ranged is always a threat. Just before we get into the roster, we should go over the 3 battle abilities that Nurgle has access to. As your units take more damage, you gain points to unlock these 3 abilities. The first one is Curse of the Slug, which slows enemy speed and charge speed by 45%. It's targeted directly and can spread to up to 5 units. Fecundity heals 0.8% of unit HP and 1% of vigor per second for 12 seconds. It is cast directly on your friendly units and again can spread to up to 5 units. And finally, Rot, Glorious Rot, deals damage over time to enemies. It is directly cast on enemy units and can spread to up to 5 of them. Need 100 points per tier, and using one ability drains the full bar to the bottom, meaning you have to start from the beginning, unlocking each one every single time. Now let's get into the roster, starting with the Lords, and of course first up we have our legendary Lord, Kugath, Plaguefather. He's of course a spellcaster, deals armor piercing damage and causes terror, and of course his magic is all the lore of Nurgle. With his massive range and powerful missile strength, you want to start your battles by selecting him a high value target to focus his fire on. Preferably something with armor to make the most of his armor piercing damage. You don't want to leave him behind as you move your army up though, as he won't be able to make the most of his magic, and could also get surrounded by enemy flankers. He can fight on the move, so keep him moving up with the rest of your army whilst firing at the enemy. Once the lines clash, he wants to use the rest of his ammo, as well as providing magical support where needed with his powerful Lore of Nurgle. Once he runs out of ammo, get him into the front line, as he's a massively tanky dude who can do a lot of melee damage, so it's just a waste to keep him out of the whole battle. Just make sure he stays with some friendly units so he doesn't get surrounded and focused down. And he can also use 3 abilities. Plaguefather's Oration grants defense and leadership in an area, Nurgling Tide summons a unit of Nurglings which can be exploded on command for some decent damage, and Virulent Contagion is a plague that spreads between up to 5 enemy units that massively reduces their melee defense stat. The next Lord is the Herald of Nurgle. These guys are spellcasters, deal armor piercing damage and have poison attacks. They can either be recruited with the Lore of Death or the Lore of Nurgle, and they are decent melee fighters with a little bit of armor piercing damage and decent melee stats, but their low armor means they shouldn't get overly involved versus anything with super high damage, at least until they get some healing or buffing magic on the go. You want to use their spells and keep them safe out of the front lines if you can. Either of their laws are full of powerful spells that can deal a lot of damage or sling out some serious buffs, so spec into their spells as soon as you can to get a ton of value out of these guys. They also emit a cloud of flies when in combat that reduce the combat effectiveness of nearby enemies even further, meaning units that get close to this guy can go from 0 to 0 extremely quickly. If you pick up their Palanquin mounts, they become extremely tanky lords destined for the front lines. If you go for the Rotfly, they're instead agile spellcasters that can charge around the map at high speed to assist with magic where needed, while still doing a decent chunk of damage. Just don't get pinned down or surrounded, as they will go down very quickly. Both of them have their own merits, but I personally prefer the Rotfly for maneuverability and increased damage. And of course, as with all Heralds of Chaos, the Heralds of Nurgle evolve into Exalted Demons. In their case, it is the Exalted Great Unclean Ones of Nurgle, which are still spellcasters, still deal armor piercing damage, and now cause terror. And they are extremely tanky boys with a ton of health, alongside decent armor and brilliant melee stats. They deal a big chunk of armor piercing damage alongside poison and magical attacks, and they can take a tremendous amount of punishment and deal a good amount too, so don't be afraid to send them into the middle of combat. Of course, they maintain whatever lore of magic they had before, so they can still provide the same spell support, albeit a bit less agile, as it won't be as simple to aid units on the other side of the map if needed. They also come with a few powerful abilities. Blight Swarm allows them to spread a plague amongst enemy units that reduces their melee defense. They have the same Cloud of Flies as Heralds, Fetid Stench reduces the leadership of nearby enemies, and Pestilent Decay deals damage to nearby enemies whilst in combat. Coming to the heroes now, first up we have the Cultists of Nurgle. These have poison attacks, and they are perhaps the biggest question mark for me, since they don't have any spells, but they also don't have great melee stats, so I'm not exactly sure how you're supposed to use them. The only real option you have is to toss them in the front lines and have them fight against anything that doesn't do too much damage, otherwise they will fall very quickly. Their armor sundering attacks will still do some great work against armored targets, and make them easier for your army to take out. Their ability is perhaps their only saving grace, as they can be very powerful. Gate of Nurgle allows them to summon a unit of Plague Bearers into battle, and in campaigns can be upgraded to allow them to summon Great Unclean Ones, which is seriously powerful if used in the right time. And finally, they can get on the single mount of the Chaos Steed, which provides them with some speed and a little bit of damage. Other than that, I probably wouldn't put them into my armies, since they just don't seem to have much of a purpose. Our other heroes are the Plagueridden. These are spellcasters, deal armor-piercing damage, and have poison attacks. They can be recruited with the Law of Nurgle or Law of Death, and these are almost exactly the same as Heralds, but they are just worse in most stats. They want to be used exactly the same, to get them into the front lines against anything without too much damage, and have them spread poison and provide spell support where needed. You can choose the opposite Law of Magic to your Lord for some variety, or simply double up on your favourite. Of course, you want to get them onto their mounts as soon as you can, as they only make them better in the exact same ways they did in the Lords. Coming to the melee infantry now, first up we have the Nurglings. These are a tier 1 unit, and have poison attacks and the Cloud of Flies aura, which reduces enemy melee attack. These adorable little dudes are the backbone swarm of your early game battles. They have a bunch of HP, but no armor, meaning once enemies are dealing even moderate amounts of damage, they are going to feel the burn and melt very quickly. In the early game, they will do surprisingly decent for you, with good damage and passable melee stats, and of course, poison attacks, which make any unit better. Still, as soon as you can, I would back them up with some larger monsters to deal the damage whilst these lads cause chaos and tank. Their small size makes them into a great meat shield, as they can perfectly fit in the gaps between the enemy and your damage dealers. Next up we have the Plague Bearers of Nurgle. These are a tier 2 unit and have poison attacks. These lads have high HP, a bit of armor, and decent melee stats and weapon damage alongside the poison. Sadly, they do not come with any armor piercing, so once they're going against anything with more armor than themselves, they're going to stop doing any damage and require some support. Like most Nurgle units, they can also feel incredibly slow, so moving them up to take on ranged enemies can feel like walking into the firing line. So try to take out enemy ranged, or at least keep them busy when you can. Once they do get into combat, they are a dense wall of flesh that will take less damaging enemies a very long time to hack through, which gives you plenty of time to bring in other units or missiles and magic for support. And of course, they also come in a variation, Exalted Plague Bearers of Nurgle. These are a tier 3 unit, keep the poison attacks, and now have a special ranged weapon. The Exalted variant gain improvements to every single stat, as well as the Death's Head's ranged weapons, which deal a good chunk of armor-piercing damage in a couple of volleys, which make for a nice initial burst of damage to whittle down the enemy troops before you even make contact. Aside from that, they are still lacking a ton of armor-piercing damage in melee, so you want to keep them supported when you can, especially if they're up against any units with armor. Once you get plenty of these guys in your armies, you should also have access to some pretty strong monsters, so their lack of damage shouldn't be a worry, and you can simply focus on doing some light range damage, and of course, being a wall of unmovable flesh. Our final melee infantry are the Forsaken of Nurgle. These are a tier 2 unit, are armoured, and have frenzy and poison attacks. There's a total 180 from Plague Bearers. Forsaken are faster and come with high armor, meaning they can take on more damaging enemies in the early game and get onto them much faster. They come with very high armor and leadership, which makes them into one of the toughest frontline holders you can get for Nurgle. Their damage output isn't too bad either, with a decent weapon damage, so anything without too much armor should go down fairly quickly. Anything better than that, and you'll want to bring in some support. They pair well with some Beasts of Nurgle for a highly damaging and fast-moving front line, especially for such a slow-moving faction. Coming to the monsters and beasts, first up we have the Chaos Furies of Nurgle. These are a tier 2 unit, and are extremely fast and come with Vanguard deployment. These are your basic, cheap early game flyers with some pretty terrible damage and low survivability. They're decent versus the enemy backline, as long as you swarm them with multiple units taking on one enemy to burst them down as quickly as possible before they take too many hits or get surrounded. Do not let them get caught out by anything with actual fighting ability, as their defense stats and HP will not stand up. Of course, every branch of Chaos has some Furies, and the Nurgle ones come with poison attacks and the Cloud of Flies ability. Next up we have the Plague Toads of Nurgle. These are a tier 1 unit, come with anti-infantry damage and poison attacks. These are the first unit you can send into the front lines for a damage boost, whilst keeping them safe. They have decent tankiness alongside respectable damage and speed. This makes them into a great addition for the front lines, as they can deal good amounts of damage to a lot of infantry at once with their high model count and splash damage. They also are your best bet for having some non-flying flanking units, since they have the highest speed of any land-based units in the faction. Just make sure they are safe, as their below average speed makes them easy to catch out of position for basically any other faction. If they do get off a flank, they will work best with multiple units going in on one enemy to knock them around and burst them down as quickly as possible. And of course, come in another variation, the Pox Riders of Nurgle, which are a tier 2 unit and still have anti-infantry damage and poison attacks. Adding the riders brings improvements to most stats, making them tougher and more damaging, meaning they hit harder and are harder for enemies to get rid of. Other than these stat differences, you can treat them and use them pretty much the same as the base toads. Get them in the front lines or around the back and let them get stuck in. The Beasts of Nurgle are another tier 2 unit and come with armor piercing damage, regeneration and poison attacks. Now we finally have some proper frontlines monsters. These gross guys are excellent for getting into your own and the enemy front lines and dealing a great chunk of damage whilst they're there. They have great health and a good bit of armor alongside decent melee stats, so take a lot of damage before they go down. They also have a high weapon damage, so you can sling out a ton of damage versus what you send them against. Put them in the middle of your front lines to ensure they stay alive and get them stuck into the enemy. Pair them with some tanky infantry to keep them safe from being surrounded, and they should do just fine versus most mid-game infantry. Rotflies are next up. They are tier 2 units and deal armor piercing damage. These are a much smaller unit size type of flying beast. These guys are a lot tankier than Furies with a ton more health alongside a decent sized helping of armor piercing damage at the cost of not being quite as quick. They are still extremely fast and deal great weapon damage with a very high weapon strength and halfway decent melee stats. You'll want to use them to take out the enemy backlines in swarms to burst them down as quickly as possible. Once this is done, then let them charge into the backs of the front lines to sandwich the enemy between them and the front lines. Against most units they should survive this, as long as they can take out their target quickly enough. Don't let them get pinned down alone in combat with anything halfway decent in melee, meaning their large HP disappears before your eyes. They also come in another variation. The Plague Drones of Nurgle are a tier 3 unit and come with armor piercing and poison attacks. Adding riders brings improvements to most stats, similar to the Plague Toads. They are essentially the same unit, but now deal and take more damage. Use them the exact same as before, and they'll perform the same job, just a little bit better. The Spawn of Nurgle is a tier 3 unit and comes with poison attacks and unbreakable. Returning from Warhammer 2, the Chaos Spawn now have a place in each of the 4 Chaos rosters. The Nurgle ones come with poison attacks and the Cloud of Flies passive. They still look mostly the same, and they still perform that way too. They are hulking masses with a ton of HP, hardly any armor, and a strong weapon strength without a ton of armor piercing. Stick them in the middle of your front lines and they will fight until either they or the enemy is dead with their unbreakable leadership. Keep them surrounded by some tanky infantry to prolong their lives as long as possible and keep them safe from enemy anti-large or ranged, as they can quickly go down if overwhelmed by either. Now final monster is the Grey Unclean one. This is the tier 3 unit, comes with armor piercing damage, causes terror and has poison and magical attacks. This lad is essentially the Exalted Lord, but with no skill tree and some slightly worse stats. They are still massive tanks with a ton of HP, as well as a boatload of armor-piercing damage and great melee stats, making them into a fat lump of nearly unkillable disease that can deal a massive amount of damage over the course of a battle. In the campaign with research, they can sling out a large number of spells from the Lore of Nurgle, which pushes them even closer to the Lords. Send these lads deep into the enemy lines to soak some damage and dish out some too. Can't really go wrong with them as long as you keep them safe from enemy range, as their large hitboxes make them into pretty easy targets to focus down. And finally we come to the missile monsters and beasts. First up we have the Plague Drones of Nurgle with Death Heads. These are tier 3 units and come with armor piercing, poison attacks and of course ranged weaponry. These boys are pretty much the same as regular Drones of Nurgle we talked about earlier, but now they have the riders and ranged weapons. They deal a good bit of armor piercing damage over a short range, but since they're flying you should have no problem getting into position as long as the enemy has no flies to take you out. Just remember to keep an eye out for enemy ranged units, as there is no easier target than a stationary flyer. Once they've run out of ammo, feel free to send them in just like you would the base unit, since they have identical melee stats. There really is no reason to upgrade to these guys, apart from cost. Now final unit is the Soul Grinder of Nurgle. This is a tier 3 unit, and it is armoured, deals armor piercing anti-infantry damage, and causes terror. Similar to the Chaos Spawn, the Soul Grinders are a unit that each of the 4 branches of Chaos have their own version of. Nurgle ones have reduced weapon strength and melee stats, but gain a ton of armor-piercing missile damage from a massive range. This makes them into a multi-class artillery piece that can snipe at the enemy from across the map, as well as get deep into the front lines to tear them to pieces up close and personal. I find it best to keep them at the back of your lines to use their steep firing arc to rain fire on clumps of enemy infantry until they are out of ammo. Once they are, then feel free to send them into the front lines alongside some tanky infantry to deal some great damage in melee. Just don't let them get surrounded or focused down by ranged fire, as, like any large target, they can go down very quickly when swamped by either. Now we come to our army compositions. In Warhammer 3, every unit has a tier from 1 to 3. Now I'm going to be using these tiers to make you some armies for the early, mid and late game, so that you are ready for every single step of your campaign. So starting with tier 1, of course we're going to go for a Herald of Nurgle, and we're picking the Lore of Nurgle. I mean, they are our only lore choice, so I kind of have to go with one of these guys, and it's the Lore of Nurgle, so you can't really go wrong. In the early game, they are decent fighters versus less damaging units, and their early spells will have some value against less armoured armies and lords. Just keep them away from high damage and you should be golden. For the front line, we're going to go with 11 Nurglings. Okay, we don't really have options here since they are the only tier 1 infantry, so this is what we have to work with. With this many of them, you should have just enough to engage the enemy front lines and send some around the sides to surround the enemy on all sides. Just make sure to support them as their damage isn't the greatest once the enemy get even a little bit of armor. Speaking of which, going to go with 8 Plague Toads. Again, don't have a lot of choice, so this is what we're going to have to go with. You'll want to send half of these into the front lines to deal some damage, then the other 4 into the back lines to take out the enemy as quickly as possible. This comp is strong firstly because it's a very cheap army, so you'll be able to get a full stack online reasonably quickly. It's also pretty fast for Nurgle, so rushing up to the enemy to bog them down and sap away their life means you'll be taking less hits from ranged on the approach. The Toads also provide a good counter to early ranged units, and the numbers advantage means you should have no issue overwhelming better units simply by surrounding them. Coming to tier 2 now, we're of course still being led by that Herald of Nurgle. Our boy should be leveling up nicely by now and have all of his spells at least unlocked, as well as a mount, and be preparing for that evolution into the Great Unclean one. If you go for the Rotfly mount, he should be fast enough to zip around and provide spell support where needed, as well as getting into some safe melee fighting. Going to pick up a Plagueridden of Death hero, picking up the Law of Death to complement our Law of Nurgle, but you could easily pick either Law and get some value. Basically, use them the same as you did with the Lord, just be more careful now you're later into the game, as you don't want them getting caught out and taken down before Immortality. For the front line, we're going to go with 6 Plagueridden. Finally, we have a tanky front line that will provide the foundation for the later game battle strategy of Nurgle. Basically, they just want to sit there and eat damage and wait for help. Speaking of help, the Beasts of Nurgle. You want to wait for the Plagueridden to make contact before sending these lads in to deal real damage in the front lines. Don't send them in first, as they will get surrounded, which is bad news for everybody. We're going to go with 4 Pox Riders of Nurgle, keeping these lads for some backlines harassment, as well as bonus damage on the front lines if you need any more. Keep them on the flanks just in case they need to get into the backs of enemies, but if not, it's just as easy to reroute them to the front lines. And closing us out, we're going to go with some Rotflies, finally picking up these lads for some air superiority and even more backlines harassment if the Toads can't get around safely. Have them blitz attack ranged units before pulling them to safety, and eventually the backs of the enemy front lines. You now have a proper front line that is going to eat any damage the enemy can throw at you and keep safe some very powerful damage dealers. The 2 magical lords can get a ton of value provided you have the wins to fuel them, and the enemy backlines don't stand a chance with all the speedy units you can toss at them. And finally we come to tier 3. Going to be leading this army with an exalted Great Unclean one, and I will never not take the evolution because these lads are just too good. Their front line's presence is immense as they clap at enemies with huge damage and spell support, and to top it off, they are nearly unkillable, especially with the Law of Nurgle healing. Our Plagueridden of Death should have grabbed all their spells and amount by now to use them the same as the Lords from the last comp. Spells where needed, some safe melee fighting. Our front line is now being upgraded to 6 Exalted Plague Bearers, slight upgrade to tankier and more damaging Plague Bearers, but their job is still the same, to be a meat shield. For the front line's damage, you're going to go with 2 Chaos Spawn of Nurgle and 2 Great Unclean ones. You're going to go with 2 of each of these lads to help out on the front lines, and the reason I've split between 2 units is threefold. Great Unclean ones are expensive, so foreign army can be a little bit rough with the economy. They also need Winds of Magic to use to the max, and with 6 casters you'd be struggling. And finally, Chaos Spawn are multiple entity units, so can hit a lot of enemies at once. Going to pick up 4 Plague Drones of Nurgle with Death's Heads, upgrading to the best flying units in the faction with some ranged firepower as well as powerful melee fighting, because why wouldn't you? And closing us out, we're going to go with 4 Soul Grinders. Yeah, these are still expensive, but with 4 of them, you can rip apart blobs of enemy infantry in a second with their powerful explosive attacks. Once they run out of ammo, they're also powerful frontlines battlers, so they can really do it all. Now, this army has massive damage outputs with a ton of high damage units and spell value, and even ranged firepower, which is rare for the faction. It's also a super tanky army with a bunch of units having 5-figure HP bars. It's also a great army for focusing damage to take out key targets with the powerful monsters and ranged fire, and you still have something to take out those backlines, so nothing is safe. And that is everything you need to know about Nurgle battles and armies. Hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful. If you did, then be sure to leave a like, it really does help out the channel so much. Leave any questions you have in the comments below and I'll be more than happy to answer them. If you want to see more videos like this showing you exactly how to play every faction in Warhammer 3, then be sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a video. On Friday, we begin the Slaanesh guide, so be very excited for that, in more ways than one. I'd like to take this time to thank all supporters of the channel, like Dominic Shamas, and in particular, Henry Tucker, XJS, and Adam T for their support at the Unclean Ones tier. Really can't thank you all enough. If you'd like to support the channel yourself, you can become a member here on YouTube, a subscriber on Twitch, or a patron on Patreon. One more time, thank you all so very much for watching, and for now, I've been COLONELDAMNEDERS, and I will see you next turn.